Excellent. Well, hello everyone that is hopping on the stream. Let's make sure there we go. Hello everyone. Dom and I are here. We had a login difficulty. The internet was very worried about the outcome of exploring the execution of Jesus. They said, whoa, Trip, if we let you put Dom on here unpacking the last week of Jesus' life and the execution of Jesus, what would happen if people that have been baptized into his body were to take the challenge? He said, seriously, while we're sitting here as a civilization trying to end ourselves, what would they do? And they said, let's not let Dom on. And well, we figured it out.
We beat them.
Yes. Well, we are super excited that you're all here. And those of you watching in all sorts of different places, feel free to chat it up throughout the visual lecture that Dom's going to present. And then we will be digging in to some of the questions and such after it. But the most important thing to remember is that this is just the beginning of some exciting things on the way. For a while, we've done a bunch of different classes here at Homebrewed, and Dom brought the heat over Advent, and quite a few of you were using the visual lectures from the Christmas Stories class in discussion groups. So what we decided to do to try something is to try a visual lecture series together. So we have already recorded the 4 main lectures of Easter stories, and then tomorrow we will put them on the website for Easter stories, and you can use them by yourself. Maybe you're on a flight and you're going to binge watch Dom dig into the Easter stories, or you're in a small group and you're going to times to watch them together, or you watch them separately and get together and discuss. All of those options are there from now through May. So either during the part of Lent up to Easter or after it, reflecting on it. And we're going to have 5 different live Q&As. So if your group wants to watch them individually and then plan a time to join the Q&A, let us know. Happy to feature questions and such from different groups getting together. That is the experiment that we're running. Because there was such a positive response to the visual lectures, which you're about to see in action, that we wanted to allow groups and communities to, have Dom visit their congregation, book group, and such, use the lecture series, and then join us for a bunch of live Q&As. So any of that you think I missed or something else we should add, Dom?
I think we got everything. It's complicated, but it is to make it as available as possible. That's what we're doing.
Yes. So today, I will be hanging out in the chat with all of you during the lecture, and then after, picking up the questions you send in and those that Dom provokes in me. So if you're dropping a question you want us to tackle later in the chat, type the word question at the front, and then I will be able to star them and save them for the Q&A time. And know whether you're on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube or wherever you're streaming it from, all of them come my way. So feel free to leave your questions. So this conversation is deeply informed by this wonderful book, The Last Week. And if you've read it before, I know you understand how great it is. And if you haven't, there's no better time than right now. So they're about to feel the lure, Dom.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Aiden.
All right. Well, here we go. I'm going to turn it over to Dom, and then we will catch back up with the Q&A time.
All right. Thank you, Trip, very much. Let me call your attention to the opening slide. Watch the hands. First of all, look at Caesar. This is from the Hermitage Museum. It's a magnificent ivory statue of, statue of Caesar. Look at his left hand. He's got That's a spear. Okay, we call it a scepter now because it's descended from the spear. What it means is he's a warrior. Look at his right hand. He's holding the orb of the world. And originally on top of that, there was a small bronze Nike, sign of victory, crowning him. You know, it's a very clear message. I own the world because I took it by force. If King Charles, if you hear about the coronation of King Charles III later this year, you'll hear about the orb and scepter. That's what you're looking at. The spear, which was the original from which the scepter descended. Now look at the other one. Jesus's left hand is a book. Not a spear, a book. It's not, how would I put it? It's not trying to take you over by force. It is trying to take you over by persuasion. The difference between violence and non-violence. But also, look, he's never reading the book. He is the norm of the book. It's always closed, or if it's open towards us, because he's the norm of the book. It doesn't need to read it, I guess. Look at the right hand. It's raised in blessing, not to own the world, but to bless the world. And you see that typical Byzantine, the three fingers, the Trinity and the two fingers, the two natures of Christ. So he's always with this 3 and 2. So when you see this advertisement that Tripp used or this, watch the fingers and the hands on these two, because they represent two radically different ways of seeing the world. Finally, the last week, which is where you should begin. It's not obviously image-based, it's text-based. It goes back to 2006, and it is the beginning of this. The lecture series will go and bring it up to 2023. Let me look at the next one, because it's a special dedication of this one in memoriam of Marcus, the co-author of The Last Week. That's a shot taken in 2005. It's the steps going down, 700 of them, flagstone steps, very scary. Some people have died on them. At Skellig Michael, about 8 miles off the Kerry coast, out in the Atlantic. You may have heard of it, not so much possibly now from the Celtic monks who lived there, as from the Skywalker, who was up there for a while. That's a separate issue we won't get into. But this is dedicated in this sort of a very symbolic departure image that I took. Sarah didn't want to go up those steps, so that day I was a photographer and I just took this picture with Marcus in front of me. I had no particular meaning from it, but now it's a very meaningful picture. So this is dedicated, this video, to Marcus, co-author of the book. Moving then to the next one. Just a reminder of the importance of images. Now, I don't know if I completely agree with this, but from the year 700, this is amazing. Somebody in the year 700 claimed that the most excellent rule for the wisest of men establishes that pictorial representations are stronger, more faithful, and mightier by far than the verbal words and biblical quotes. I put it up there, not because I really want to defend it, but I think actually text and image are equally important, because we have different senses and different registers. But just to think about it, I'm doing visual theology, but I'm interested in the meaning of the images, not just in admiring them. Moving then to the next one, we're getting into our subject. I'll be dealing with 3 basic questions. This is the first one. And the background is that image of the temple. Imagine it as 3 football fields across, 5 football fields in length, huge actually. And you can see the white part of the inner part of the temple. And then if you look way to the left corner, you can barely see it. That's the Fortress Antonia, called after Mark Antony, which overlooks, in both senses of the word, the temple, and gives you a sense of the atmosphere into what we're getting into. Now, here's my question. Please, for a moment, forget Jesus. Forget the execution. I will bring you back, I promise, faithfully. Here's the question. How did Jewish leaders, how did they interact with the Romanization of their homeland? How did they act in the first 100 years? Now, what I'm doing here is very important for me. I don't start with the text, which after all was written maybe 40, 50, 60 years later. I start with what we know about what was going on at the time. So I'm trying to imagine the situation in the 30s in the temple. That's my question. Then moving to the next one. So my first slides, my first images are going to be all from Josephus. And the point I'm making is this. There were two tremendous violent revolts against Roman power, Roman occupation, one in 4 BCE at the death of Herod the Great, and of course the Great War that started in 66. I'm focusing now on what on in between, because my thesis is, and I'll show you the evidence, that in that 70 years in between, there were tremendously important experiments with the creation of nonviolent resistance. I am not talking about nonviolence. Josephus was all for nonviolence, so was Rome. Nonviolence resistance. In between the terrible violent revolts, the sages of Israel experimented with nonviolence, and it's into that matrix I'm going to put John the Baptist and Jesus. So now, looking at the image, and the images here are, no, I won't move to that one for a second. Yeah. The first one, all my images are from Josephus's texts in the Middle Ages, because this is important too in itself. In the Middle Ages, Latin translations and French translations of Jewish antiquities and Jewish war, in that order, Jewish antiquities and the Jewish war, were promoted, I would say, as propaganda, let me put it bluntly, by Christian authors who said, see, Jewish antiquities parallels our Christian Old Testament. See, we have a Jewish sage supporting us, and the Jewish war can be compared with our New Testament. And it was used in that way. So I want to insist that the use of Josephus in the Middle Ages was highly important because it, quotation marks, collaborated the Christian Bible. That's why we get them. Okay, the picture shows the capture of Jodfat. Down at the right-hand corner, you can see their names are written on their clothes. Josephus has been brought before, actually Titus is the one there facing him, and Vespasian is over with the sword in the left bottom. And then way up in the top left-hand corner, Nero is sending out the troops, as it were, and then Jodfat is the tower. So what happened, as you know, is Josephus was caught, the general of the Galilee, let's call him. He surrendered to Titus and Vespasian. Actually, Vespasian was still in charge at this time. And since he prophesied that Vespasian would be the Messiah, you can forgive Josephus for certain things. That one's pretty hard to forgive him for. Vespasian was the Messiah because he would become emperor while on Jewish soil. So moving then to the next one. And by the way, I read Josephus every bit as critically. I really do, as I would read any other text, including the New Testament. I don't just take him as if he was somehow gospel. This image you see on the throne, to the left is Titus, in the middle is Vespasian. He's handing over the world. Here we go with the orb of the world again. He's handing it from Vespasian to his son Titus. Over on the right is Josephus bringing his Jewish antiquities and Jewish war to present to his sponsors, the Flavian dynasty. Moving to the next one. I always put underneath these images where they're from. That's both to acknowledge copyright and also with great gratitude. I won't read them to you, but they're there if anyone wants to take time. So now my major issue is that Josephus, as I said, records, and he records through gritted teeth. He really, really doesn't like this nonviolent resistance stuff. He understands violent resistance. That happens all the time. It's against the will of God, of course, because God wants Rome to run the world, says Josephus, as a good Roman supporter. But this nonviolent resistance, he doesn't even want to acknowledge it, because, of course, if Rome decided that nonviolent resistance was part of the Jewish religion, that might be the end of it as a religion. So he quarantines it. He tucks it away as a fourth philosophy. Doesn't even always want to name it. There's the Sadducees, there's the Pharisees, there's the Essenes, and they're the normal. He calls them philosophies. You know, they really are political factions. They're different leadership proposals, let me put, of how to handle the Romans. That's really what's going on. But they're just philosophies. How can you be... Rome doesn't crucify philosophers. So this is just the fourth philosophy. And he's backwards and forwards between, is it really part of our tradition? Is it new? Is it invalid? But he admits it. So we have to watch now in the first decades of the first century. I'm watching Nonviolent Resistance. And of course, you know what I'm going for. It is being created. I can't find it anywhere else in history as a programmatic strategy. I'm not talking about individuals, of course. I'm talking about a programmatic strategy when a small country, as it were, is faced with a huge power and it decides, in the name of God, by the way, on nonviolent resistance. So moving to the next one. Again, in a lot of these, you can see that's the Latin word quoniam, and the Q has little images inside it. It's called historiated initials. You see Josephus is presenting once again to Vespasian and Titus. The fourth philosophy has two main streams, and we won't get to go into them today. John the Baptist and somebody called Theudas, and then somebody called the Egyptian, who go out into the desert and they conduct reenactments of great salvific events from the past, when they came out of the desert, crossed the Jordan into the promised land, and the walls of Jericho fell to the ground. So let us now go out and do the same. We'll approach from the desert into the promised land, and God will do the same. And of course, they were executed or killed. But it's nonviolent resistance, hoping that God will reenact the same things that God did in the past, as with Joshua against the Canaanites, so now against the Romans. And there's the second type as well, and that will be the next slide. And what happens in the next slide is, these are very different. These are very specific, something that they did that forced people to go out and react to them. The other ones, you had named leaders, as it were. Here we don't have any named leaders, but we have mass activities. And by the way, that T there is from the word Titus. And you can see Titus shown inside his own T initial, again from the Great Museum in Paris. The second type, these are massed, nonviolent protest strikes. Please don't think I'm trying to be wicked and using words like strikes. Do you really think we invented everything? This is the creation of nonviolent resistance by Jewish leaders between the two great revolts of 4 BCE and 66. So against the tax census in 6 CE, against Pilate's standards and using temple money for an aqueduct in the 20s, and especially against Caligula, because it's against the emperor. It's against Caligula's statue in 40 CE. And I'm going to look at this a little closer, because this is really the test case. Now, please understand, as we go to the next slide, I am not off the subject. I am preparing the matrix for Jesus. This is one of the earliest images we have of Josephus. He's called Josephus the Historian, and it's from the 9th century, from the 800s. And here's what he says about these. I'm going to call them fourth philosophers, if you want, or nonviolent resistance. He's comparing them actually to the urban terrorists that we know as the Sicarii, who carried little short daggers under their cloaks. And as Josephus said, the terror they created was much greater than the event itself, because everyone's afraid, he says, in the great crowds that somebody is going to be assassinated. But of course, to be fair, To be fair, the Sicario only struck Jewish leaders who were collaborators. Anyway, Josephus says, besides these ones, which I could call urban terrorists is a fair term, there arose another body of villains with purer hands but more impious intentions. That's his definition of nonviolent resistance. No blood on your hands, but impious intentions. He calls them deceivers, impostors, under the pretense of divine inspiration, fostering revolutionary changes, they persuaded the multitude and led them out into the desert under the belief that God would there give them tokens of deliverance. That's his Hellenistic language, and you can see what's happening. Why would you go out into the desert? Because that's where you came from. You crossed the desert, from the desert, crossing the Jordan into the promised land, either from Egypt, in the exodus from Egypt, or in the return from Babylon. And surely if we do it now again, now God will act and give us again deliverance. And you know, of course, what happened. But let me look at the next slide for a second. Oh, I just wanted to show you this one, because part of what's happening is this is being used as propaganda in the Middle Ages. See what happened in the Jewish war to Jerusalem? This is God's punishment for Christ. Now, I don't believe that for a second, but that's why we have these. It's not that they were suddenly so interested in Josephus, because no Jewish authority had ever kept Josephus. If we wouldn't even have Josephus if it wasn't for Christians who were using it. Unfortunately, they were often using it for propaganda, as you see there, comparing the church with her staff and the synagogue shown blindfolded and a broken staff. And this is the price of having so many of these medieval texts of Josephus, that they're being used for propaganda in favor of Christianity and against Judaism. All right, going to the next slide. All right, here's what I want to look at in just for a few minutes. In the year 40, and it's either at harvesting time or planting time. And that's terribly important, because that means the danger of famine. If you don't harvest or you don't plant for the next year, there's going to be famine. The governor of Syria, Petronius, is ordered by Caligula, the emperor, to take 2 of his 4 legions. So he knew what was going to happen. Take 2 of his 4 Syrian legions and come down into northern Israel and put my statue, says Caligula, if I'm a god, that my statue should be in the temple of Jerusalem. So I want my statue there as myself as Jupiter. Now, this could have been the War of 66 in 40 CE. This is the abomination of desolation. So moving to the next slide. What happened? Here's the point. It's an agricultural sit-down strike. And again, I say, please don't think I'm trying to be modern or with it. That's what it was. That was the whole point of either being planting, because we have 2 sources for this. One is Philo, one in Josephus. And Philo says the wheat crop was just ripe, and so were the other cereals. And he feared, this is the governor, that the Jews might lay waste the arable land or set fire to the cornfields. Okay, that's Philo. Here's Josephus. The people left their fields to sit protesting, and since the land was unsown, there would be a harvest of banditry next year. You're going to die of starvation. You might as well die in any case. So the first point, we're having agricultural sit-down strike. The next image and the next point, these are all images, of course, of Caligula that you're looking at. This, I imagine, this might be something, this is a statue of Caligula, something like we are to imagine. Obviously, we don't have the statue, but I'm looking at his right hand, and I kind of imagine there might be thunderbolts in there. So Caligula as Jupiter would have looked something like this. So the second major point after the strike is unarmed thousands. Now, I know numbers in Philo and Josephus tend to get a little bit inflated. With Josephus, sometimes I divide by 10 and disbelieve the result, but in any case, a large crowd. Philo, the inhabitants of the holy city and the rest of the country, a vast crowd, unarmed. That's what they say when they confront. The governor is, Petronius is at Ptolemais, which is like the staging area. Every time the Syrian legions come south to invade the Jewish homeland, their staging area is Ptolemais on the coast in Galilee. A vast multitude, said Josephus, tens of thousands. And that number repeated 4 times. And they said again, on no account would we fight. So moving then to the next one. Again, the theology behind this is sacrificial martyrdom. You could say, well, it's the only sensible thing to do, because if they try to attack the legions, they'll be destroyed. But, well, that's not the reason that's given. Philo makes it almost seems like a liturgical procession. They're like proceeding to the sacrifice. They were divided into 6 companies, as might happen in a liturgy: old men, young men, boys, old women, mature women, and maidens. And they said, if we cannot prevail with you in this, we offer ourselves for destruction. We gladly put our throats at your disposal. Okay, now, some of this is a little bit too Baroque, but I think it comes loud and clear that that's the theology behind it. Again, Josephus, Petronius must first sacrifice the entire Jewish nation. They presented themselves with their wives and their children. It's not wise for a huge group of men to approach a legionary camp. If they bring their wives and their children, it is, of course, ferociously dangerous, but at least it sends a clear sign. We're not coming to attack. Ready for the slaughter, falling on their faces, baring their throats, they declared they were ready to be slain. Now, even with the inflated rhetoric and all of this, when you compare Philo with Josephus, it all makes sense. If Caligula's statue is going, that's another statue of Caligula, as you can see. If that's going into the temple at Jerusalem, well, you might as well die. Whether it would have stayed nonviolent, that's a separate issue. But by great good luck, I suppose, except for Caligula, somebody assassinated him, and Petronius wasn't put to death because he was stalling like mad. And so it had a happy ending, shall we say. And then now moving to the next. All right. Please hold on to all of that. I'm claiming the matrix of the first century was experimented nonviolent resistance, and it's within that I'm going to understand Jesus as a nonviolent resistor against Rome. He did not invent it. He partook of it and was part with it. And I would really like far more Jewish theologians and Christian theologians to spend time with Josephus and all of that nonviolent resistance. It's there. And what's fascinating is that Josephus hates it. I think he's more tolerant of violent resistance, actually, than he is of nonviolent resistance. So that's why I take it with as being very truthful, because he really doesn't like it. Anyway, next question. Why did Jesus go to Jerusalem that Passover of 30 CE? Around Passover. That's the best guess of the time. Passover, I think, is right. 30 is probably a very good reconstruction. Okay, moving to the next one. Second question now we're dealing with. Okay, you could break down the question. If you think Jesus went regularly to Jerusalem for Passover every year, which I do not, I don't think a day laborer could be gone for a couple of weeks every year. But anyway, what happened this time that never happened before? If he went regularly, why did it happen this time? If Jesus only went this one time, and he certainly went this one time at least, why did he go this one time? What's he up to in plain language? Now, there's 2 very huge explanations up there. So I'm asking sub-question. Did Jesus go to Jerusalem for martyrdom? Now, just to hold it at that point. That is possible. You can imagine a person choosing martyrdom for a movement. Wouldn't be the first time or the only time. But did Jesus go to Jerusalem for martyrdom either as a vicarious atonement for sin, which is the dominant Protestant explanation for many people, or as an obedient model for suffering, which is the Roman Catholic model for many people? Did he go for martyrdom for either of those purposes? And if you move to the next slide, then here's how I answer that question. I'm not trying to go into the mind of Jesus. And yes, I do know quite clearly that in Mark's gospel, he keeps telling people he's going up there, in a sense, for martyrdom. I know all that. What I want to do is watch his actions. It was not difficult in the first century to get yourself executed. Actually, Antipas would have done it in Galilee. Jesus didn't have to go to Jerusalem. And Pilate would have been quite accommodating. So I'm watching the actions of Jesus and his supporters to try and understand what's going on. Here's what I think happened. Here's my explanation. I think he was challenged by supporters and possibly relatives in Jerusalem to bring his divine rule movement, his kingdom of God movement, to Jerusalem. Maybe they said to him, I don't know this has just been unkind. Maybe they said, get out of those hick towns in Galilee, come up where the action is, come up to the capital, come up at Jerusalem when there's Jews from all over the Mediterranean here. If you're serious about your movement, bring it here where it counts. Come up for a demonstration. Again, I'm not trying to be wicked. We didn't invent demonstrations. Against both imperial Romanization and high priestly collaboration. And they must have said, from what he did, we will supply protective security by day in the temple, the crowd will be with you, and by night at Bethany. No, you're not going to stay in the city. Every night, get out of the city, round the Mount of Olives to Bethany. People can disappear even in moonlight nights in the city at night. Everything I see happening makes sense to me of somebody who expects, quite bluntly, to get away with it. Now, of course, it takes no prophetic understanding or divine forewarning to know this is deadly dangerous. Of course it is. But it isn't, if I may be blunt, looking for martyrdom. If you wanted martyrdom, it could easily have been arranged by what we call the evening of Palm Sunday. So now let me unpack that in the next slide. I said protective security by day with the crowd. If you go into the next one, then we can take a look at the texts. I probably just indicate these two. I maybe not read them in great depth. But if you look, obviously, of course, Mark, for example, doesn't use Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. You know that. But he goes to a lot of trouble to say this day, the next day, the next day, this day. So you can really work your way day by day through our, what we call, Holy Week. Sunday, of course, the first demonstration, you know it. We call it a triumphal entry into Jerusalem. It's actually a kind of an anti-triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Many people spread their cloaks, all right? Those are supporters. Then Monday, after the second demonstration, this is the miscalled cleansing of the temple. We'll get to that in a minute. The chief priests and the scribes wanted to have him executed. And by the way, we don't have to demonize good old Caiaphas. He's a collaborator. If you prefer the term, he's a quisling. He's collaborating with the Roman authority, with Pilate. And actually, after 10 years of collaboration, even the Romans found it was too much and dumped both of them, dismissed both of them, fired them. They were afraid of him because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. The whole crowd. That's called support. That's like a defensive screen. The next day, even after all these debates. It's mentioned 3 times. Look at that. The crowd, talking about John, the crowd. Then after he tells the parable, the parable of the workers, the people who killed the son of the vineyard owner, they wanted to arrest him, the authorities, of course, but they feared the crowd. A large crowd was listening to him with delight. That's pounded home. The crowd, the crowd, the crowd. That's his safety by day. All right. And if you move then to the next slide, think of security by night. That's our next one. He gets to Bethany. We can move, I think, to the next slide to see it. You're constantly reminded at the end of the day, he leaves. It's very obvious on what we call Palm Sunday. They approach Jerusalem, and it's at Bethany, near the Mount of Olives. He gets the transportation, the donkey. Now, it's almost like a setup. This is all prepared before. Here I am. Now we're ready. Sunday evening again, he entered Jerusalem, went into the temple, did nothing, and left. I can't make any sense of that except to say he went out to Bethany with the 12. That establishes on what we call Palm Sunday the pattern. He just left. He started from Bethany. He went to Jerusalem. He got the donkey in Bethany, went to Jerusalem, then went back to Bethany. Next day, came from Bethany. You kind of would know that. You want to say, come on, we was there last Sunday night. So evening, out of the city. Tuesday, come back in. And then Tuesday evening, he goes to the Mount of Olives. Moving to the next one. If you look, sorry, that's right. I wanted to raise the third question. So we looked at what was happening in the general matrix of the first century, why Jesus went, and then what happened as best we can figure it out. So moving to the next slide. All right. What danger does he have? I mean, we have those protective screens, as we said, the crowd by day, Bethany by night. There are peculiar dangers because it's Passover. Peculiar, I mean, they would be danger at any time, but peculiar. The first one is the volatile character of Pilate. That's a shot from Monreale Cathedral, where I take most of my, thanks to Sarah's photography, take most of my images. It's a magnificent mosaic of Jesus before Pilate. All right, going to the next one. Of all the people we know, the governors of the first century, and some of them we only know their name, we really know about Pilate. And I don't mean the New Testament. I mean outside the New Testament. And I remind you, by the way, that he and Caiaphas were removed as high priest and governor, sub-governor actually, by the Syrian governor Vitellius. Let me pause for a second. The first century Roman administration of Palestine, of the Jewish homeland, was rotten. I mean, they begin with the country divided between Herodian princes, then between a Herodian prince and a sub-governor, then again by Agrippa I as a king of the whole country, then by a governor of the whole country. It's like they can't make up their mind how to run the place. So you have a sub-governor looking over his head at his boss in Syria, who can fire him anytime he wants. And he's dealing with Caiaphas, who's looking over his shoulder at other high priestly candidates, and he can be fired whenever the sub-governor wants. That's no way to run a country. No wonder it's a mess. And as Tacitus said, their patience still lasted until the War of 66. Okay, anyway, here's Pilate. Here's what we know about Pilate from Philo. A man of very inflexible disposition, merciless, obstinate, corruption, insolence, rapine, insulting, cruelty, murders, untried and uncondemned, never-ending and gratuitous, most grievous inhumanity, a man of ferocious. You always want to say, oh, come on, Philo, nobody can be that bad. But even if it's a bit overdone, this is the character in the first century whom Pilate chooses to give as a model of a bad governor. Briberies, insults, robberies, outrages, injuries, executions without trial, ceaseless and supremely grievous cruelty. So Pilate is deadly dangerous. He's in charge with extra forces. So moving to the next one. The second, we're really touching now on the second one. Pilate and the governor, if you look at the top left corner of your screens, that palace, that's Herod the Great's magnificent palace at Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea on the coast. That's where the governor was located. A lovely site on the coast. But for Passover, you can move to the next slide. He came up to Jerusalem and took probably about 600 extra troops with him. And this gives a second danger to Jesus, the volatile situation of Passover. Again, look at that to your left. Look at the Fortress Antonia, overlooking, in both senses of the word, as I said, the court of the Gentiles, in fact. And try and imagine this, crowded with people for Passover, crowded. So anything, and they're celebrating freedom from Egypt, from Egyptian bondage when they're under Roman bondage, and all they have to do is look up at the Fortress Antonia and see troops, not legionary troops, of course, but police troops at least, on the balconies, looking at them. So if you go to the next slide, these are two instances we know of Passover riots. And again, let me repeat how dangerous a riot was in that crowded, even if nobody attacked anyone, a riot would cause a stampede, and a stampede would cause people slaughtering one another. They'd just be trodden down. So what I'm insisting on, extra troops for Passover, zero toleration for coughing too loud. All you'd need somebody to say, why are we taking this Roman stuff when we're celebrating getting rid of Egyptian oppression? Why are we still under Roman oppression? So, for example, at the Feast of Passover, it did not appear that Archelaus, this is Archelaus in what, 4 BCE, the multitude could be restrained without bloodshed, so he sent his whole army upon them, falling upon them in sudden as they were offering their sacrifices, destroyed about 3,000 of them. 3,000 in 4 BCE. You see, there's a mistake there in Luke 13. I'm not certain where that question mark. Well, that question mark is supposed to be there. No, that's right. Because we're not certain if that's what Luke is referring to when he talks about Pilate and the sacrifice of people offering their sacrifices. Anyway, 4 BCE. Now, the next one is in 50 against the governor Cumanus after Jesus. So before Jesus, after Jesus. Again, the same thing happening. Huge number of people, and then the whole army is sent in. Again, whole army is probably an exaggeration. A great number of people were pressed to death in those narrow passages, no fewer than 20,000 or 10,000, but a large number of people were killed. So against Jesus are two things: the volatile nature of Pilate and the volatile situation at Passover. So moving then to the next one. What does Jesus do? I want to look at these two actions of Jesus. Again, the images are, as you can see, are from Monreale Cathedral in Palermo. These are demonstrations. I have no other word I can use for them. They are not violent demonstrations, but neither are they talk. They are what you and I would call activist. And Rome, let me insist again, did not crucify philosophers. They did crucify activists. We'll see that as we go. So the first action by Jesus, a demonstration against imperial Romanization, symbolized, in this case, of course, by Pilate's arrival. And as we say in the book, Pilate, of course, comes in from the west. Whenever he came from the west, and he came, no doubt, on a horse. Not in a chariot, of course, but on a horse. And he's coming up with extra forces, as we said, for Passover. Jesus is coming in from Bethany, so he's coming in from the east. And what it is a dangerously, I mean, it's theologically profound, but it's almost dangerously close to a caricature, to a kind of Saturday Night Live of Pilate's arrival. Because Jesus is coming in on a donkey. And sometimes it's shown, this may be an artistic mistake, but it's shown with the little foal by her side. So he's riding on a nursing donkey, which no male should do. So this sends a message. You don't want people to say, oh, poor Jesus, he had to walk all the way from Galilee. He couldn't quite make the last mile or so he needed a donkey. No, you want them, of course, to think about the text in Zechariah. Your king comes to you triumphant and victorious, humble and riding on a donkey. But what kind of triumph and victory is it? He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, the war horse from Jerusalem. The battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. This is a classic demonstration of nonviolent resistance. And the subtext in the background is that text from Zechariah. But it's also extremely public. And anyone reading the story should wonder, why is Jesus still alive by midnight on what we call Palm Sunday? And that goes back, of course, as we said, to his protective screen by the crowd and getting out of the city by night. So moving now to a second action. Oh, no, sorry. I forgot this slide. Very, very seldom have I found anywhere that actually shows this prelude to the entry into Jerusalem. If you read it, when they were approaching Jerusalem at Bethany, he tells them, go get the donkey. Go get the donkey. And it reads as if, well, okay, this is all prepared demonstration. We know he's coming. We have the donkey. He's going to ride into Jerusalem for Bethany on the donkey. Okay, here I am. Go get the donkey. Like Mark, it sort of reads almost like, prophetic knowledge. But if you actually read it, it's quite clear. Go get the donkey. And that's why I put this one in. All right, moving to the next one then. All right, this is the second action of Jesus. I'm reading it as a demonstration against high priestly imperial collaboration, symboled here by the temple's fiscal basis, sacrificial business. He is not cleansing the temple. He is closing it down. He's shutting it up. And he's doing that not physically as if this was a violent assault, but the money changers tables, and there is nothing being done wrong by the money changers. What they're doing is, if I was a pagan pilgrim coming to this great temple and I wanted to make my donation, which of course I would want to do, I would want to change it into the currency that was acceptable, and I would go to them. They're in the court of the Gentiles. There is nothing, except maybe some covert anti-Semitism, that there's anything happening that's wrong. But the whole temple, this giant temple's fiscal basis is on these gifts, which are either sent every year from Jewish people around the Mediterranean or by pilgrims. Also, of course, Jesus, be very careful here, only in John's gospel, he drives out the animals that were used for sacrifice, and therefore only in John's gospel does he use the whip of cords. It's not used on people, it's used on the animals. That's why it's only in John's gospel. So this is not a violent act, but yeah, it's a demonstration. It's a bit like during the Vietnam War, if somebody went into a draft office and poured even red material on the draft cards. No, it didn't shut down the temple. It didn't shut down the war, but it's a demonstration against it. And here again, the subtext is given in that phrase, den of thieves. And please understand, of course, that a den of thieves is where thieves, it's a safe house for thieves. You don't do your thieving in your den. It's where you run for safety when you've thieved elsewhere. So this doesn't mean these people with the money changers are thieving. But go read Jeremiah chapter 7 and 26. God tells Jeremiah, stand in front of the temple, warn people, if you keep using the temple as a refuge for injustice, and you think you get to the temple and say, oh, the temple, ooh, we're safe, then I bring the temple down around your ears. And Josephus, Jeremiah was almost killed for doing exactly what Jesus is doing symbolically. He's shutting down the temple for collaboration with the injustice of Romanization. Moving then to the next one. This is something you can read for yourselves. The contrast on Wednesday that Mark makes between the betrayal by Judas and the woman who anoints Jesus, the woman who believes in him and the man who does not believe in him. I'll let you read that for yourself. Moving to the next slide. Look at the geography. The temple is on the left, and you see the Mount of Olives, and you can go around the Mount of Olives to the north or to the south. That's what Jesus is doing every night, get to Bethany where it's safe. Now, try and imagine with or without Judas. If I'm thinking like Caiaphas, I really don't need you, Judas. I can figure it out after a certain time. I know what he's doing. Every night, Jesus leaves the temple, leaves Jerusalem. He goes to Bethany. He either goes around the Mount of Olives to the north or the south. He can't climb it. So if I set up somewhere around what we call Gethsemane, where the road goes either way, I can get him. I think that's exactly what happened. I leave it open with or without Judas. He's not certainly necessary. Caiaphas was in for 10 years. He knew what he was doing. And the right thing would be for him to figure out, I will get Jesus. I will get him in the dark. I will get him executed before anyone knows what's going on. So then moving to the next slide. Here's now where we really begin to focus in on what happened. For violent resistance, Rome crucified the leader and his major supporters. That was the whole function of like the group. It was a warning. As soon as you saw a group, you knew what was happening. In Jerusalem, for example, 2,000 were crucified in 4 BCE and 500 a day in 70 until they ran out of trees, said Josephus. And you remember Barabbas in Mark 15:7. He's in jail, and so are his supporters. So for violent resistance, Rome wanted, how would I put it, the horrible carnival of death. So people would look and see a whole crowd. Oh, that's what happens to violent resistance. Don't have anything to do with it. Now, for nonviolent resistance, moving to the next slide. For nonviolent resistance, here's the civil law. The civil law for nonviolent resistance. Rome crucified only the leader. Quote, the authors of sedition and tumult, we call them activists, or those who stir up the people, we call them activists, shall according to their rank be crucified, cast to wild beasts, or deported to an island. Exactly what happens to Jesus, as you know, and deported to an island is what happens to John of Patmos. So he must have had some kind of a patron who was important and thrown to the wild beast, Ignatius of Antioch. So this is the Roman way of handling nonviolent resistance. Don't waste yourself with a squad of soldiers and iron nails and all of that on the followers. Crucify the leader and they'll all disappear. Therefore, of course, on the next slide, Rome has to figure out, how come it didn't work like that? We crucified the leader and they're still around. So at the end of the first century, in the 90s with Josephus, and then in the first decades of the second century, Tacitus, both have to explain, well, we crucified the leader and it didn't work. And Josephus, as you know, who's been careful, he's in Rome in the 90s, he doesn't want to cause any trouble. He says those who had in the first place come to love him, love meaning loyalty to him, did not give up their affection for him. And the whole tribe of the Christians to this day has not disappeared. Tacitus, who could never write without a sneer on his pen, says that it's like a disease. Diseases spread. So no surprise, it came into the capital where everything rotten arrives eventually. But see, both of them have to explain, we crucified him and it didn't work. And we have to give you an explanation. Because when we crucify a leader, that's usually the end of the movement. Going now to the next one. That means, for example, that this famous picture in which Pilate is addressing, look at the crowd up everywhere. He's addressing Jerusalem. So all Jerusalem is guilty for the death of Jesus. Moving to the next slide, however. Look what happens when Matthew copies Mark. Mark says, as we know, the crowd. So, sorry, that's to satisfy the crows. I'm sorry. The crowd protects Jesus. Then Matthew changes it from the crowd to the crowds to the whole people. To the whole people. But what happened, of course, was that a small crowd came up to get Barabbas off, to get their hero Barabbas off. How many? Well, how many do you think should come up to the governor at Passover to get a guy out of jail who was in there for insurrection? I would think the crowd that came up from Barabbas, and wanted Barabbas, of course, not Jesus, couldn't care about Jesus, they wanted their guy Barabbas out. I would say 6 to 8 people probably is pushing their luck. Pilate might easily decide, okay, good, more of their supporters, throw them into jail too. So no, it's not the whole people. It really isn't. All right, moving to the next slide. So I want to end, as we come to an end, with this parable. It is a parable. Of course, it's not an historical event. This is the discussion, as it were, on the rule of God and the rule of civilization, because that's what Rome was. It brought civilization to these barbarians. It brought them law and order. Jesus answered, my kingdom is not from this world. If it were, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over. But not even to get me safe do my followers fight. This is not my kingdom. So there in that parable, brilliantly summarized, is the core difference between the rule of God on earth and the rule of civilization itself. One is based on, not on nonviolence, but on nonviolent resistance to violence, and the other is based on the monopoly of violence. Let me move to the next one then as we're closing down. I just want to remind you of something. The last week, of course, is where you should begin, but the last week is mostly about the texts. And for the next 4 lectures, what I'm suggesting to you is that book, Resurrecting Easter, which has now been remaindered, or whatever you call it. It's no longer going to be published because it was expensive. There was no way we could bring a book out with 4 color photographs any cheaper. But I am suggesting to you, if for background for the next 4 lectures, use the last week to begin with. And then if you can, get not the book, because it's almost impossible to find it, there will be, get the Kindle version of it, but watch it with the Kindle app. Don't watch it, I would suggest, on a Kindle, because it'll come up black and white. On the Kindle app, what I've been doing is first time I ever bought one of my own Kindles, I got the Kindle app to test it. I put it on my cell phone. I connected my cell phone to large smart TV, and you can blow it up and see the images as wide as you want. So if you're using them, especially as a group, I would suggest it. But again, on the Kindle app, either on your iPad or your smartphone. At least it works for the ones I have. And then you can project it onto the crowd. I think we have maybe the final slide. Let me think. We have one more, I think. Okay. I just want to give you this as a kind of preview of where we're going. It's back to that Morgan Museum and Library. They were very kind and generous with the use of this. You can see the T on the left for, I think it was for Titus, the beginning of 6-1 of the Jewish War. And then the word C on the right, the letter C. On the left, you have the Western vision of individual resurrection. Jesus is coming out of the tomb. He happens to be standing in one of the soldiers, which you might wonder why you would do that. It might wake him up a bit. But at least that's the Western individual exaltation of Jesus. I'm going to use a careful term. And on the right, you have Adam and Eve coming out of the jaws of Hades, at least, though I think it's been turned in with licks of fire into hell. And this is the Eastern vision of the resurrection. The individual on the left and the universal on the right. And with that, I think we are ready, Trip, to open it for questions. I went a little over the
right. Excellent, Dom. All right, so we have a number of questions, and I think the first one is when was it in the history of wrestling with these texts that the historical matrix was lost? And at what point would you say, as a scholar of the New Testament, did we gain enough historical framework and of the historical matrix to start raising these kinds of questions again?
Oh, it was lost. Let me put it. It was lost neutrally very early, in the sense that people just didn't know it. But I think it was also lost kind of professionally and deliberately after the 4th century. I mean, you really don't want to keep saying the Roman Empire crucified Christ, and you guys are the heirs of the Roman Empire, because that's what they were. The Eastern Roman Empire was also the Roman Empire. We call it the Byzantines. So I think it was also not just neutrally. You know, all of a sudden in the Creed, Pilate comes from nowhere, crucified under Pontius Pilate. If you didn't know what was going on, who's he? Where did the Romans come from? So I think there was almost a deliberate say, we don't want to talk about that. That'll raise issues about government. Well, maybe we can get away by saying, well, the Romans were pagans, see. That's why they were evil. If we have a Christian empire, everything is lovely. But that's pretty dangerous. So I think it wasn't just neutral loss of history, like, you know, people had no way of knowing that this was their text. I think it was, you know, the Enlightenment. It really was with the Enlightenment when people said, what's your source? And they said, in fact, something like an opinion without evidence is called bias. An opinion against evidence is called prejudice. Where's your evidence? Show me the texts. So that's why I began this one by showing them the evidence I have in a critical reading of Josephus to understand what's going on. Then I will take the gospel text, which is admittedly good news. That's an interpretation, and see, oh, this works though. This really fits. This makes sense. That Jesus has said all of this before he went up doesn't, but so I end up with a kind of a confirmation of the historical Jesus. And I see then, as a historian, why people would look at Jesus and say, for example, he's the Son of God or the Messiah or something else. I see why other people might say, no way. That's what I have to be able to explain. So I think it was at the Enlightenment, questions were asked. Whether in the 1st century did God regularly suspend all the rules that God regularly operates, you might call it divine consistency. They didn't know yet enough about physics, but divine consistency, they kind of trusted the world. And so I think once history started coming in, okay, that makes sense to me. I see why this worked. I see why these people were not evil. So it just made sense of it. But it still left you, of course, with the claim, the ultimate claim, which side are you on? Caesar or Christ? That was the basic question they were asking.
Now, Monica asked, and this is in reference to something you said at the end about that contrast with civilization.
Yeah.
Do you see this kind of critique of civilization running through the scripture? And if so, how do you see Jesus inheriting it?
Yeah, I really do. I think if you go back to the Jewish laws, I mean, it would have made sense to them to say, God gives everyone an empire, so our turn will come around and eventually we'll be beating up everyone else like the Assyrians, Babylonians, all the rest of it. Instead, they come up with this magnificent idea that nobody should be beating up anybody, but there should be peace. It's not an intuitive idea for anyone who's ever lived in this world. The intuitive idea is it's always been like this, so that's the way it is. Now, their term for it very often was this world. So the world was the world of creation. They never talked about civilization. They talked about this world, and this world wasn't pretty good because it looked like it always was one empire after another, one dreary one after another. And sometimes the solution was someday next week, God's going to end the whole thing. Okay, well, that didn't work. So it raised the issues of what are we going to do with this world? Now we have the Romans. It's not like empires are getting weaker, they're getting stronger, and the promises are getting longer. And oh, we're so tired with the promises. They've been around for 500 years. It's going to be soon, in days to come. So I think it becomes radicalized, and people begin to think there has to be something deeper wrong here. And I think that's what happens with civilization. I think that's my word for it. So the challenge as I see it at the moment would be something like post-civilization. How can we imagine a world which reverses what we have been doing and calling civilization, which is a triple onslaught, as I see it, on our environment, other species, and ourselves? So they don't really, well, I think they ask the question of the sustainability of our species. They don't use that language. But I'm seeing it too clearly in the Bible to think I'm just imagining it in their language.
Yeah. So you talked about these two types of in kind of getting a typology of sorts of the fourth philosophy, those that were centered on a figure and those that were centered as protest movements around like the object that is generating the response. How was the Jewish self-conception of God's relationship to history, God's covenantal promises, like how were those changing such that the people came to respond in larger numbers to that option than at other points in their history? Like, what were the unique kind of religious imagery and symbols that were harnessed along with the historical matrix that generated this kind of first network of nonviolent resistance?
Okay. Well, what we can see, and again, it's a wide open question, and I invite people go in like me and read Josephus carefully, to even against himself, to be able to answer this better than I can. But here's what I can see. The Romans arrived. They put in Herod the Great. That's typically what they do, a powerful puppet king or client king, if you want to be polite. How does it go? He really holds the Jewish homeland for Rome. He dies in 4 BCE, and all hell breaks loose all over the country. It's not a coordinated revolt. It's like the pressure cooker blows at the whole kitchen all over the country. So bad that the Syrian legions, they're located south of Syria to guard the Euphrates frontier. Because if the Parthians are watching television, they're going to see, hey, the legions have gone south. Let's go west. So it's terribly dangerous. And when they come south, they come down with fire and sword to teach you guys a lesson, so we won't have to come back. So, of course, at the beginning, they did well. They always do well, like the Irish always did well until the dragoons arrived. So they started off well. I think it ends up with 3 legions down there. And slaughter. And, of course, they come through the whole country. It's not just they take a boat and arrive, for Jerusalem. They come right through the whole country. So the whole country is devastated. They live off the land. And of course, all the other support groups all around add in for the loot. So it's not just a legion comes, 5,000 troops. It's all the support. They devastate the land. Now, okay, you have to think, if you're any sort of a leader at that, what do we do now? Do we give in? Do we Romanize? Do we have another revolt? I think there were some who probably said, yes, we wait and we get ready. And when the time is ripe, we try again. I grew up with that history and I understand it. I don't know how many times a small country has to lose before it either wins or gives up. But I don't think it was gone. What is new is this idea that happens within 10 years, in 6 CE. After 10 years, this disastrous idea of putting Archelaus in, which major political mistake by Augustus, he's so bad and was so bad from the beginning, and he should have known, and it was evident. He should never have put Archelaus in as governor of Samaria, Judea, and Idumea. He has this, he's dumped, he's fired. And immediately a governor is going to be put in. And when the governor is put in, first thing he's going to do is take a census for taxation of property, by the way. Josephus insists it's not personal head tax, it's property tax. All right, now what are we going to do? Right away, we're being counted for taxation for property. Do we have an armed revolt again, or do we do nothing? It's in the context of 6 CE that, and Josephus is pretty clear on this, not in the Jewish war, but in the Jewish antiquities, and he names even the people, a Sadducee, not a Sadducee, I'm sorry, a Pharisee. He names the people who start the movement. And if you read, it's tortuous, because the thing he deadly does not want to say, it came out of our religion. Because then Rome might say, as it did with the Celts, okay, your religion is forbidden. That's it. That's the end. No more religion, no more revolt. So I think out of that tortured matrix and experience, they decided to experiment. And Josephus knows all about it. But for him, as a Jew, this is why you can't say the Jewish response was this or that. As a Jew, he believes, I think he's sincere, I guess, that God has given power to the Romans. His statement is, God goes around the world and gives power to this empire after another. Now the power of God rests on Rome. Oh,
yeah.
Rests also on the Flavian dynasty. In fact, Vespasian, as we said, was the Messiah. So I think in that matrix, they're caught of either armed revolt again and more devastation, each time worse, or something else. And it's in that time, in 6, that they begin to experiment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Josephus and Tacitus both have to explain why the crucifixion of Jesus, the nonviolent leader, didn't stop the Jesus movement. In that experience, you get something different than in the followers of Jesus following his death than a lot of the precursors and others. When knowing that a lot of the theological language is the event of Easter, and that we're going into Easter stories and looking at the way they play out through church history. How do you as a historian take evidence like that to help those wrestling with those theological responses, nest them in the actual materiality of what was going on after the death of Jesus?
Yeah, but sometimes it's explained by theologians and not by me. Well, Jesus resurrected. Nobody else did. So therefore, end of story. It was like the Big Bang that started everything. I don't see that at all. In fact, one of the things we're going to have to talk about is modes of exaltation. I'm using a neutral term for that. But for the moment, I think something Jesus did during his own life and his own strategy was terribly important. What had happened was too deeply embedded in too many people to be let go. And here's what I think was important. we have in the texts the evidence that Jesus sent out other people. We talk about the 12, whether there were 12 or not, but he sent them out and told them to go do what I'm doing. Heal the sick, eat with them, and announce that God's rule is here. He didn't settle down at Nazareth and say, I am the Messiah or whatever, go out and bring people to me. He could have. I think Jesus had made far too profound a communal response that it could be dismissed. In other words, they had experienced what God's rule was like. Heck, this works. Now, if everything depended on Jesus and everyone saw him as Son of God, Messiah, and our job is just to follow along, I think you could have kissed it all goodbye. It might have hung in there like it did for John the Baptist for one generation, so the people who were involved, the next generation, would have not experienced anything. But Jesus is proclaiming, if we live like this, we will experience God's rule. That's, I understand his message. Not it's coming soon, but if you participate in it, you make it happen. All right, enough people did it. Say, yeah. And so as soon as Jesus was crucified, and they had visions, because I think people did have visions. That's nothing particularly new, to be quite honest with you. People have visions whenever there's a sudden death of a beloved person. I'd expect it. If it wasn't there, I'd presume it. But the question we have to talk about in the next 4 lectures is, they could have come up with ascension. They could have come up with resurrection. How did they decide how to interpret the visions? You can have a vision. How do you interpret it? The vision could be a fact. People have visions like they have dreams. But the interpretation of a dream is something else. So I think Jesus had profoundly altered the consciousness of enough people that they just couldn't say, well, it's over. It was a nice hope. It was good, seemed to work, but it didn't work, so he's gone. That's the only explanation, the only difference I can see, especially with another martyr like John the Baptist, who had a movement, but I think it was very much his movement. I mean, John was the Baptist. Even Josephus called him that. Jesus was the Messiah, but I think more importantly, had focused on God's rule. But God's rule is a communal thing. He could be the Messiah, and everyone said, well, he's the Messiah, isn't that lovely? Now he's dead. Guess he wasn't. But God's rule, you can't have a rule of one person. You have to have a community. So I think that's the only explanation I can make, that Jesus had made it real for enough people that they had to not give up. They couldn't give up.
Yeah.
That's who they were.
Yeah. All right. Here we go. We got a question from Stephen. Judas, was he a historical person?
Oh, Stephen, I've gone backwards and forwards on that. I think if you probably went through my writings, you'd find yes and no. I never was certain more than 51%. Let me put it that way, because it fits so well with Mark's attack on the 12. I mean, he excoriates the 12 from one end to the other, and he always insists that Judas was one of the 12. So I think if I had to really say now, I don't find him necessary. I think what happened makes absolute sense to me, as I said, with Caiaphas figuring out where to get him, how to get him in the dark, how to get him executed before people have time to know what's going on and they're busy with Passover festivals. So I would say he's not necessary, and probably if I really had to decide it, I don't think so. I think the story doesn't need him. I think it's part of Mark.
All right. Nicholas asked, was Jesus' demonstration in the temple in response to priestly capitulation to Roman rule, collaborating with Pilate, making sacrifices on behalf of the emperor, etc., or something else?
I think something else, actually, Nicholas, because I'm trusting, actually, at least that the den of thieves seems to come across. that the background story, the background text to that is Zechariah 7. And the reason Zechariah 7, he's told to stand in front of the temple on a day of high festival and warn them not to use the temple, not to use sacrifice as a refuge and excuse for injustice. Don't use sacrifice in the temple to get you off the hook for injustice out of the temple. Don't use worship to excuse injustice, which is what a lot of religions do, of course. So that's what almost gets Zachary killed, for even suggesting that God might destroy the temple so you can't use it as your safe house. So I think the only thing he's destroying the temple for is that because it collaborates with the Roman rule and promotes injustice, or that the high priestly leadership in itself was promoting injustice. And I want to repeat again, we touched on this, I think, some time ago, that of course, in the Great Revolt of 66 to 74, when the peasant fighters were forced into Jerusalem, the first thing they did was turn against the high priestly establishment. So do not think that the high priestly establishment represented the general mood of the people, the ordinary people, in the first century. It didn't, and probably the reason was it collaborated with the Romans. That was their job, that was their career. And again, you don't have to demonize them, they're quislings.
So in your lecture, you talked about how Jesus was challenged probably by his peers, people in the movement, say, take the divine rule movement to Jerusalem, demonstrate against Roman imperialism, the high priestly collaboration with it. And in the Synoptic Gospels, that turn happens at the Mount of Transfiguration, right? Like you get in the Synoptics, and he turned his eye to Jerusalem. That's also in those texts you get pretty regularly there. You get Peter and James and John in different scenes resisting Jesus's turn towards Jerusalem and clearly aware of the threat of violence. So when you think of this historical matrix and then you look back at the way Jerusalem comes on the radar for Jesus and the proclamation of the kingdom of God, and the resistance and debate about going there in the disciples, how does the historical framework help you reread and engage what's going on in those particular synoptic narratives?
Yeah, and the strange thing is, in Mark, as you know, 3 times Jesus says, we're going up to Jerusalem, I'm going to be executed or crucified, and then I'm going to rise. And then the last time he says it, what's in chapter 10, I think, he almost gives you a blow by blow of everything that's going to happen, and Mark follows it. So I would find, when that happens, I would expect the response, what do you mean executed? What do you mean resurrected? Instead of which, as you know, they go off saying stupid stuff like, well, yeah, fine, good. But what about first seats and, all that type of stuff? Mark really uses these magnificent prophecies, if they were prophecies, just to denigrate the disciples. They totally ignore Jesus. They almost, it's like embarrassing. So I don't consider that as historical. Now, I do consider historical that Jesus would have known the danger, of course. Of course. And I think even the people at Bethany may well be his relatives. I think more than just supporters, because at the time of the Maccabees, huge numbers of Judeans emigrated north to Galilee, and I would find no problem with the family of Jesus having relatives, say at Bethany or at least in Judea. So I think that's the matrix of security. Now, what Mark wants to say on the one hand is, of course, what happened to Jesus was willed by Jesus. That's why he tells it. But even when Mark doing that, I don't think he's primarily interested in that at all. I think he's primarily interested in that no matter what Jesus told these guys, they didn't get it. I think if you take that chapter 10, everything is going to happen to him, then watch what happens to him in Mark. Jesus is like running through a script that's been already written.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, now there are two other questions that are related, and I think they'll connect to what we're going to end up doing in the class. But we had one questioner ask, "How do these lessons?" And this was at the end of the lecture, apply to us today, along with if the American empire is in decline, what do you think the repercussions are for the future of the evolution of American Christianity? And I think both of those questions come when people wrestling with those three challenges that you mentioned, right? Around the death to the planet, our creaturely neighbors, and ourselves as a species, and then look at those challenges and go, we need, right, another kind of rule to manage our relations. We need a different vision of what of goodness, the good life looks like, and such. When you are asked these kind of step back questions, right? Not the normal things that happen in your New Testament class. I'm sure, like, what are the places you start to talk about it? But I will tell everyone, Dom gets pretty clear at the end of the lecture series about just how these challenges can go.
Let me use an example. Part of what the Irish did was not save civilization, but since the Roman Empire had never got to Ireland, they saved Western Christianity. They really did, Latin Christianity, because they didn't have it stuck with Rome. So I want to make a very clear distinction between America, even as our beloved homeland, and American Christianity. No, whatever happens to America, Christianity is a separate issue. And I want to make that quite clear. But I think what we have to face is it now evident that our sustainability as a species is in question? Or is this just some dramatic stuff that I'm saying because I'm getting old or something? Or we're saying because it makes good television or whatever? Are we actually facing a clear and present danger to our species, which is only evident now, not so much created now, but accelerated now? If it isn't, then we can just ignore it. It's just, interesting apocalyptic imagination or something. If it is, then that's what we have to start insisting on, and not letting the entertainment of political discussions about something else obscure it. Do we have to wait until the Arctic ice starts lapping at Manhattan? It's hard not to say this without sounding dramatic, but my problem, as you know, Trip, is that I see this in the Bible as a warning, and I see it now on the news as another warning, and I'm hoping we can take very seriously that question. But you have to admit it is a question first. It's not an ethical question about our responsibility as Christians. It is a species question it's an evolutionary question about the sustainability of our species. I also see it, of course, as an ethical question. But if somebody says, well, I'm not into ethics, I don't like the Bible, I'm not into Christianity or that religious stuff, fine. We can talk this in the public square about the sustainability of our species. And that's where I would like to get people who know much more about evolution than I do. And they wouldn't have to know an awful lot, but who know much more than I do, to talk to us, to see how the biblical matrix and the evolutionary matrix can collide, shall I say? And that's especially helpful when you have somebody who knows evolution and has a conscience about what is happening. But these are the questions, of course. I don't find them extraneous. I don't find them, well, I really want to talk about Pilate and all the rest of it. Because the question of relevance applies when any person, even 2,000 years ago, makes a claim about humanity, about the world, about this earth. Then I'm going to judge them on that claim. If Jesus was just talking about, here's how we should handle the Romans, and this will be good advice, fine. honor him with how to handle the Romans. Maybe we can learn something, maybe not. But these people are making claims about how the world must be. It's not fair to say, okay, they wrote good Greek or something. They made a claim about the world. Do you think they're idiots? Or do you think they might be right? Nobody thinks that Socrates and Plato were talking only to the Greeks of the 300s BCE. Why would we think Jesus and Paul are talking only to their fellow Jews in the 100s? They claim. So these are the questions we have to be asking. And they are the questions behind the next 4 lectures.
Well, I am definitely looking forward to all the conversation about them. For those of you that are on the stream or listening or watching this later and want to get the visual lecture series from Dom, head over to easterwithcrossan.com. You'll be able to sign up, get the videos. You can watch them by yourself with a group and such. And then through Lent and then through Eastertide, we have 5 different live Q&As, and we want you to utilize those. You can, if you're in, once you sign up, you'll be put in a Facebook group, you'll be on an email list, and you can respond to any of the emails or send in questions for the Q&As. You can also join them live, like some of you did today, whose questions we tackled. But our goal really is to equip you to have the lecture series so you can have Dom show up in whatever group you want, engage it deeply, collect your questions, wrestle with it, talk about it, and then join any of the live streams with your group or your friends. And given the ecological crisis, this is quite the effective way of having a legendary New Testament scholar show up in your Bible study, your small group, your reading group, your pub group, and such. So we're excited to test this out. If you know friends and colleagues that would enjoy something like this, let them know. And if you are in a group and your group's going to join one of the live streams, you can let me know, and I can help you set up stuff so you'll be able to stream it large in whatever your setting is, and maybe be able to pop on and have someone from your group, ask the question and things. Dom and I are both excited about the possibilities of doing public scholarship through technology, and this idea came out of our last class on the Christmas stories. So as someone who enjoys testing and having a partner who's not just a gifted communicator and creating the visual lectures and such, but also a willing collaborator for propagating awesome scholarship on the internet. We're pretty excited about this. It's going to be fun. It's going to be fun. So head over to easterwithcrossan.com. Any final words, Dom, before we head off and people start engaging the lecture series?
No, I think we're all set to go into the lectures. And I was thinking when you mentioned the Transfiguration, that's a very good example. The Transfiguration is clearly an ascension. Mm-hmm. You got Moses there and Ezekiel. They're up there already waiting to greet Jesus. Why is that not the model? Where did resurrection come from? That's ascension. Good. So I was thinking when you said that, good. That's a good lead-in. That gets us into it.
All righty. Well, thank you all for joining us, and we will look forward to seeing you on the live Q&As after you get to dig in to Dom's visual lectures.